So welcome back to Now Behind the Theme. Today we're talking about Hammer the Scots by Columbia Games again. And today we're continuing the history of William Wallace with the Battle of Stirling Bridge and hopefully some less known facts. So let's get into it. Now, from where we last left off, Wallace had gone off to basically, to the English terms, become a terrorist / outlaw. But he was not the only one. There were several groups basically doing the same thing, and they were quite successful. Now, the English administrators and commander felt that this could not continue, and they probably were getting to a size that they felt that if they didn't nip it in the bud, it would get a lot worse. So they gathered their army and moved across Scotland and headed to Stirling. Now, for note, Stirling is not the capital of Scotland. That would be Edinburgh. But in my humble opinion, Stirling is probably the most important point in Scotland. And why is that? Well, you see, it's actually down to simply geography. The thing is, Stirling Castle is built to overlook the River Forth. And the River Forth, mind you, cuts Scotland almost in half. And there's only a few crossing points. Thus, if you want to head anywhere north of Scotland, or even control the points of travel, you really had to hold Stirling. Which is the reason why throughout the history, you can see that people would lose Edinburgh, the capital, but the last place to be taken was usually Stirling, as commanders rightfully held the position that holding the strategic crossing points of Stirling was way more important than Edinburgh. So the English army gathers and it arrives at Stirling, where Wallace and Andrew Murray had come together to fight the English. Now, of course, they were at the opposite ends of the River Forth, the English on the side of Stirling Castle and Wallace and Murray on the side opposite it. Now, according to numbers, and this varies from documentary to documentary, historical book to historical book, but on a higher scale, the Scots were said to be outnumbered as the Battle of Stirling Bridge by 5-1. And in case you have come here just watching Braveheart, this is not a plains battle, this is not a set-piece battle, so to speak. Set-piece battle does look cooler. So from a entertainment standpoint, I can understand, but from a historical standpoint, it was extremely inaccurate. Now, the day of the battle, and this is one of those things in history that just happens. Nobles being nobles, the commander of the English army woke up late, and so they could not actually use the original crossing point of ford in the River Forth that they wanted to use. And that was pretty important because this crossing point at low tide could allow 5 knights side by side to cross the River Forth at the same time. But when he woke up, the tide had already risen and thus that ford could not be used. So what they did was they went a mile down to Stirling Bridge. Now, the thing you need to know about Stirling Bridge is that it's not the Stirling Bridge you see today. That bridge is actually a more modern construction. The real bridge, mind you, was lost, so to speak, until amateur archaeologists found it by finding the 8 stone pillars that were in the riverbed. And of course, it fit the historical record that it was actually a wooden bridge. In fact, it was a Roman bridge. And one of the reasons why we know is because, one, the construction, and two, wood was actually very scarce in Scotland. Now, it was built diagonally. No one knows why. But we know this is the bridge because even with coins of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, they showed that there were these 8 stone pillars that held out the wooden bridge. So there is good concrete proof that this was where the Battle of Stirling was. The wooden bridge at Stirling only could allow 2 knights to cross at the same time across the bridge. Of course, on their big destriers and all. And of course, this would all play a very big part in the strategy and the battle. Now, the first thing that happens is, being heavily, overwhelmingly superior in numbers and everything, the English commanders sent over 2 monks to talk to Wallace and Murray, telling them basically to surrender. You know, that part is like, you can imagine like the movie probably, where the commander just stands there and goes like, you know, offer them terms and expected them probably to surrender, seeing the size of the mighty English host. But of course, Wallace and probably Murray, but sad to say that Wallace gets a lot of the airtime in Blind Harry's epic poem about him. And to summarize, he basically said, go back, we're here to fight. So the monks go back, English, they start moving their troops across the bridge. Very, very slowly. Now, it is at this point, and it's easy for people who read about the Battle of Stirling Bridge to insult the English commander Rightfully so to a certain extent, seeing that he overslept and it's caused his army a very big strategic position. But you also have to understand that the culture at the time of chivalry meant that the English commanders probably did seriously think, and remember they were fighting against Wallace, who was a son of a knight, that the Scots would allow the full English might to cross the bridge, set up, and then they would have a good chivalrous battle. Man on man, mano a mano. Of course, Wallace didn't see it that way. And of course, that was pure suicide. And at the point when 2,000 infantry and 100 knights had crossed, they say Wallace's men had prepared the bridge, and they did something and the bridge dismantled. And it is at this point that then Wallace and Andrew Murray came down from the hill and charged the forces of the English. Now, of course, the problem was that the areas near the River Forth at high tide, especially as the tide got higher, gets more boggy. On top of that, you have to understand, of course, that when people are crossing, back then, there wasn't like radio walkie-talkies and everything, so there were a big chaos. On top of that, you got 100 knights who, being knights and nobles, probably didn't take to taking orders very well other than from their direct superiors, so they probably would have not been in the best battle order. And on top of that situation, the ground on which Stirling has is not a flat piece of ground. It has a lot of troughs and pits where, I like how one historian put it, that there was no way that a cavalryman could ride non-stop at full speed on the grounds, because if they did, if a horse got his leg trapped inside one of the pits and all, it would have snapped it. So basically you have to imagine that, you know, like if this was a battle like that the English were bottled into this situation whereby they kept getting pushed tighter and tighter. You must imagine there have been several gaps and everything, which were all, in an ancient battle, is always a disaster. And the Scots, to what I know, was all infantry, could charge in, and if they needed to, could pull back a bit. They had space to basically maneuver and widen their frontage, whereas the English were basically being pushed back into the River Forth, literally. So the English basically had no defensive frontage and no place to maneuver. So of course it was an absolute massacre. And thus, seeing the whole situation and the whole debacle that happened, the commander and the rest of the troops on the other side of the bridge that had not crossed retreated back into Stirling Castle. And Wallace all gathered themselves, of course, naturally very happy before. I'm sure they also had doubts of whether they would win this day, considering the history of Scottish losses. And they crossed the River Forth and took siege on Stirling Castle, and the garrison, along with the commander of the English forces, surrendered, freeing Scotland before Edward Longshanks himself would take the situation in hand. Now, after the battle, seeing as this great success that even great nobles and kings of Scotland could not do, William Wallace and Andrew Murray were given the titles of the Stewards of Scotland. But there was only one problem. One of the casualties of the Battle of Stirling Bridge was Andrew Murray. Or in some sources they say he died soon after the battle. But this is where the real huge legend of William Wallace must have taken off, because with the death of Andrew Murray, which is pretty sad seeing as he probably was a very brave man, a very patriotic man, it meant that all this adoration and all this patriotism was heaped onto one person, which was William Wallace. And of course the problem with a hierarchical society is that the nobles accepted that Wallace had become the Steward of Scotland. But there was of course a lot of good evidence also that said that they weren't too happy about it, as it was along the lines of, this knight is going to tell me, a noble lord, what to do. I don't think so. That was the problem that William Wallace straight away had to deal with. Now, that being said, although Scotland was so-called free from English yoke, it didn't mean that there weren't English troops and garrisons around. For the period before Edward I brought his men back to take Scotland, there were a lot of sieges to remove English garrisons and administrators. Wallace would take a castle, and instead of putting garrison troops in it, he actually would tear the castle down, as they probably knew that with the overwhelming English might, that even if they held the castle, it will only be taken back by the English and used against them more effectively. So In many cases, Wallace, as Robert the Bruce later on would do, is that they would tear down the castles, in fact, making them ineffective. So that was the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Next time we'll talk about the Battle of Falkirk and the fall of William Wallace. So subscribe, let me know what you think. Thank you very much. Till next word.